Ministers are gathering for a brainstorming summit on how to negotiate the UK's exit from the EU. Theresa May has called the Cabinet to Chequers, the Prime Minister's country residence, to thrash out a strategy. She's reportedly told them to come armed with ideas to make Brexit a success. The key issues are expected to be the single market and freedom of movement. Mrs May has already said the government will not trigger Article 50 and the process of separation until at least the start of next year. Well, let's talk now to Conservative MPs Kwasi Kwarteng, who voted for Britain to leave the EU, and Sir Peter Bottomley, who voted to remain.
Hi.
Thank you both for coming in. Sir Peter Bottomley, you didn't want Britain to leave, but you have said that the best now needs to be made of the situation. So
absolutely right.
What does it look like for you?
Well, before the decision was made, we would either stay in, but not be quite the same as everybody else, or come out, but not get terribly far away. I don't think anyone's arguing for separation other than leaving the European Union. But we have close neighbours, we have close trading ties, and I think we ought to look on how we can put the C into exiting, make it exciting in some way. And my advice to the leaders, our negotiators, is keep a subdued ego. Don't start putting stories in the papers about yourself. Don't start saying how you're going to put one over the Europeans, but try to work cooperatively.
So that's the long-term negotiating strategy. But what about, right, what would your ideal be right now when you look at balancing trade and immigration?
Well, the European Union needs reform. So by leaving, I think we ought to be saying to them, why don't you come with us and make the EU change? We won't come back in, but make the EU different, so that people don't have the difficulties.
Why will they listen to us? I mean, anything that, you know, we're going out. This is about us going forward now. So what do we want? Do we want
because it's good for
a trade relationship?
The answer to your question is it's good for us and it's good for them. We don't want things which are good for us and bad for them. We want things which are good for us and good for others.
How do you see it?
I think Peter's right. I think that we have to cooperate with them in a spirit of friendliness and cooperation. But I do think that this issue of freedom of movement is very important. And, for example, I mean, it was the fact that David Cameron couldn't get a concession on freedom of movement. That's what caused this whole thing to happen in the first place, in many ways. And certainly from my point of view, and many people in my constituency, the reason we voted out was that we wanted to get a concession on freedom of movement. Now, if they come to us and say that isn't possible, I think we have to look at perhaps even exiting the single market. I don't have a problem
so
with that.
So the freedom of movement trumps everything as far as you're concerned?
Well, look at what's happened. We had a Prime Minister, he's left. He lost a referendum. One of the big issues in that referendum was, frankly, this issue of freedom of movement. And if we don't get a concession on this...
when you say a concession, what do you think it should be?
Well, I think that at the moment, anyone with an EU passport can come to Britain. Without a job, they can just come. And clearly, during the course of the campaign, I thought the campaign, as Sir Peter did, this was a big issue, the issues about immigration,
so what should it look like going forward?
So what I'm saying is that we need to have a situation in which people don't have the right. They don't simply have the right to come. They have to have a job in order to come. There has to be some sort of arrangement.
So not a situation like Norway, then, that has to accept freedom of movement?
No, I don't see why we had the referendum in the first place.
So it's a red line, is it, for you?
For me,
okay, complete red line.
Is a red line.
So Sir Peter Bottomley, would it be a red line for you?
I haven't done research into Kwasi. I come from a family of people who've tried to find agreements. They're called diplomats, they're called colonial service, they're called doctors and teachers and things. Rather than just draw red lines, you end up sort of boxed in. I think you ought to try to say to our partners in Europe and the rest of the world, let's go on developing the rest of the world which has free trade. Let's have movement for people who have jobs and who are needed. Let's consider what people can do when they retire. I think it's quite important that people shouldn't be tied to their own country in retirement, which I think is a slight variation on freedom of movement. It's the ability to do things rather than always the right to do things.
What about what people voted for here, though? And the very clear message was, we don't want that freedom of movement anymore.
I was trying to put it rather more delicately.
Yeah. But I mean, you have to look both ways, don't you? Not just to the negotiations with Europe, but to what people want here.
The ability of my hospital to recruit East European doctors and nurses is actually saying, we've got a job, will you come here? And you ought to be able to do it as easily as it can from the Philippines, which is not always easy, but if there's a job, you can come. There are certain categories of workers. So that is an ability to come when you're needed. Kwasi and I don't think would be...
We're not questioning that. I mean, the issue about freedom of movement is people coming on spec. Now...
It's about who gets the right to decide and whether the government here gets to control it.
That's right, but there's also a big issue about people coming to Britain who don't have jobs, who are simply coming to Britain because they have the right to, and then they may pick up jobs, they may do whatever they're doing. But that's one of the fundamental issues about this whole debate.
So when you're describing what you're describing, Peter, in terms of who should be allowed to come in, that is then ensuring that the government has the right to decide, isn't it? Which is completely different, obviously, to what
the British political process works, which is partly government, it's partly the feeling of the people, it's partly what Parliament says, it's partly what the law says, and there are 3 or 4 players in all this. But I think the other thing we have to bear in mind is that we need to keep an eye on what we want for long term, for us, for Europe, for the world, and we want to work out how to do the transition, which is going to be very, very complicated. It won't always be difficult, but very complicated. Most of our environmental protections are within the European Union and the world. How do we come out of those? That should be easier to resolve. The question of tariffs should be relatively easy. The question of things like the rights of European health insurance when we go abroad, that should be manageable. But all these things are going to require time, and Kwasi's word of cooperation is the right one. He and I will probably agree on 3/4 of things. I think you'll find that those who voted to stay in and those who voted to go out agree on 3/4 of things. So let's not try to look for the punch-ups, let's try to look for the practical ways. But my resolve is to get things which are good for the United Kingdom and good for Europe and good for the world.
Today, the powwow at Chequers,
Sure.
do you expect that to end in consensus?
Well, I think there'll be different views. I mean, as Peter suggested, we have slightly different views. Clearly, we need to cooperate, but in a negotiation, I would stress that our job is to look after our interests. They will look after their interests. But obviously, you know, we have to have a spirit of openness. But we've also got to listen to what the people have decided and what they voted, and they had a very clear message. So I would suggest to the Prime Minister and to the government that you know, they need to take on board what actually happened in the referendum.
I'll have one bit of
Quick
private
final
advice in
thought.
public. Every media should say to anybody who briefs on behalf of an individual cabinet minister, we're recording this and we'll use it. Just ban off-the-record briefings by individual cabinet ministers,
All right,
and then you'll have the government work better.
We'll see if that happens. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Big Man Tyrone here. Make sure to subscribe to the wicked awesome Robin Hood UKIP YouTube website. He exposes the leftist crops on the British brainwashing corporation. Nice.